Yeah.
Yeah.
The weird stuff.
You guys don't have the handout, and I don't know if that's actually a better setup than having it, because there's a lot, and we're just going to cover what we can cover today. This may or may not help you to follow, but it's just something. I just want to start by saying, last semester we did the Hebrew Bible, and we started by talking about why we might call it the Hebrew Bible instead of the Old Testament. As you can imagine, then there's a similar issue when we get to the New Testament. It is slightly different because it's not a scripture we share with somebody else. At the same time, after some conversations with Rabbi Sarah Bremer-Schley at the college, and sort of thinking through it, I'm trying to get better at calling it the Christian Testament. So testament just means witness, right? And to me, that makes a little more sense, but I'm not great at that yet. That's new for me. I think I've always done the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. You will hear me say that, I promise, but I'm trying. That is simply because of that same issue we talked about last time in terms of how do we think about ourselves relative to our Jewish friends with whom we share a pretty big chunk of our scripture and with whom we have a questionable history, to put it kindly, in terms of thinking about us being like the replacement, or them not accepting our scriptures as a problem and all of that kind of stuff. We have some issues. I will try to call it the Christian Testament. I do believe you all are more familiar with the Christian Testament, the New Testament, so that's kind of a leg up this semester. I am going to start, like I did last time, with some timelining. And so I'm hopeful that I can get you guys faced to the timeline and able to see it. And I'm going to do that here in just a second. And we're going to basically start where we left off with Ezra and Nehemiah, where they rebuild the temple, right? After coming back from exile, rebuild the temple. As you might remember, Ezra and Nehemiah are the secondary part of the secondary history. So the temple now, very important, very, very important to the Jewish people. A couple weeks ago, I don't remember if we read the lectionary text or if I just mentioned it, but I talked about how when they rebuilt that temple, the governor, Nehemiah, called all the people together, right? And then Ezra read to the whole gathered community the Torah, which sort of reestablished them as a community bound by this covenant, reminding them of kind of where they came from before they all either got conquered or occupied or exiled. That's where we're going to pick up, basically, because it turns out a lot happens between kind of the end of the Hebrew scriptures and the beginning of the Christian scriptures, like a lot, and really, really, really big things. If you've ever wondered why are the Hebrew scriptures written in Hebrew and the Christian scriptures written in, anyone? Greek. What happened? Same group, right? Jews, they're same group. A lot happened. So I'm going to try to set you guys up so you can see, because I didn't get something ready that I could easily email out. So hold on. All right. So I'm hopeful. Can you see that a little bit? My hands will be up there showing you where we are. It should become more clear. So try this. Okay. First, a very quick reminder. First, ignore all that for a second and remember that our timeline went back to there, right? For the Hebrew scriptures. This is the Christian scriptures. Everything. Life, death of Jesus, and all the writings of the scriptures. Here. Compared to that, okay? We're talking about a much shorter time frame this semester, a much shorter time frame. but we will still need to think about things that happen and when they happen and when the writings happen. But, you know, this is now going to be this, okay? But I had to spread it out.
So that's blowing up that little,
Yeah, this is blowing up
Got it.
this.
got it.
Okay, this is just to remind us, okay? Okay, but we're gonna start back. Ezra, Nehemiah, with this, what's called the Second Temple period, okay? And also called, for those of us that have another testament, the intertestament period, intertestamental period, basically what happened between the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures. So as you remember, here's the Second Temple built after they come back from exile. I need my markers, not my pencil. That's perfect. And then here is a major event, okay? So Alexander the Great, Greek, conquers a huge swath of land, including our little Levant, if you remember, right? But also like Babylon and Assyria and Egypt, okay? Huge swath of land. He did not rule for very long, but he made huge kind of gains in land, and more importantly, and this is a huge issue, in culture. Alexander the Great was intentionally connected to Greek culture and believed it was needed to be spread. Okay, he was into Aristotle, Plato, like all these folks, right? And he believed that culture was much better than the Aramaic culture, the Hebrew culture, any of those cultures, Egypt, any of the stuff that we studied last time, Mesopotamia. He believed those were like backwards and primitive and whatever words we want to put on it. He spread a culture intentionally, okay? So a couple things happened with that. So it's called Hellenization, okay? That's the process it's known as, the Hellenized culture. So the language was Greek. So Greek starts spreading. Also, for those of you that kind of know your Aristotle and Plato, we start to get concepts, you know, the Hebrew Bible is very narrative, it contradicts itself, it moves forward and backwards and retells the story and tells it differently and, you know, very narrative. Greek culture was about positing things, making claims, right? It was dualistic. We start to get ideas like good and bad, moral and immoral, good in society, bad in society, in groups, out groups. This dualism is part of Aristotle's thinking and Plato's thinking, and Alexander the Great all into that, like quite. And again, intentionally, like he had all these like scientific people on his staff, his historical people, geological people, climatologists on his staff, all these people, it's very scientific for that time, and considered superior and sophisticated. As you can imagine, it spread first in what areas? Hellenization.
All that.
Well, yeah, but like, how does culture often spread and progress? Starting where?
Commerce,
What?
commerce,
Which is centered in what? Cities, urban areas,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Jerusalem being one of them, by the way. It starts in urban areas, so that is where Hellenization started. And then you have people in rural areas, not necessarily being affected by that or being as affected or as quickly affected. And so, okay, backing up. So just keep that in mind. So we have Alexander the Great, but he really ruled for a very short time. So basically, he's kind of right in here, actually. Pretty short time. After he died, there is a huge power struggle among his generals, which are based in all of these different places that in the area that he has conquered. There are about 4 of these generals. We're going to talk about 2, and I don't ever remember the name of the other 2 generals. I'm certainly not going to ask you to, and you probably don't even need to know these names except to keep track of history. So the Ptolemaic kingdom, which is actually starts with a T. Ptolemy is Egypt. Okay. And that Egypt, that's first. Ptolemy is the one that kind of takes over where our folks live, where our Jewish ancestors live, okay? And they, interestingly, they kind of thought, Jews, do your thing, not going to worry too much about it, although again, culturally things are changing. But Ptolemy didn't have that much interest in Jews, which allowed them a certain independence, and including around the temple, right? But after Ptolemy, the next general who took over Palestine, the Palestinian area, I never spelled Seleucid, so that's second. And that's, sorry, these are kind of both still in this period here. Anyway, he took over Palestine, and the first thing he did was made them pay him a ton of money. He asked for compensation for kindly ruling over their land. Okay, so that's pretty big. And in 175, so now we're about here, okay, somebody named, and again, up to you if you want to memorize this. The name is not as important. Antiochus takes the throne, the Seleucid throne. And it turns out he was a huge believer in this cultural change. So he kind of goes on a campaign to make sure everyone is Hellenized. Basically the Jewish urban, and especially the Jewish urban elite, by that time they were fine. They were into that. So they kind of complied. This is when they start to make the temple hierarchy look a little bit like the civil hierarchy. So high priests come into this time, and there's bids for those positions, and then they kind of hierarchical. So the temple looks a little bit like the cultural situation around them. But this led to internal Jewish conflict, and in fact, quite a bit. And especially between the urban elite, and then on one side kind of, and then also the urban poor, and of course, the rural countryside. Those folks, especially the rural countryside, they're not fans of Hellenization. For one, it's not Hebrew. For two, it really is a kind of, you're supposed to be educated, you're supposed to read, you're supposed to go to these theaters and all this stuff, gymnasiums, there's all these things you do that they don't have access to. But their Jewish brothers and sisters at the temple are hook, line, and sinker, they're it. So now you have a whole temple system, which is very important, and then these countryside folks who feel like they're losing their faith, or feel like their Jewish folks in the city are losing the thread because of Hellenization. In Jerusalem, and again, this is all right around the 200 mark, okay? In Jerusalem, it led to a revolt of the urban poor, okay? And they became linked to these peasants in the countryside, and they revolted. And it started this kind of war, basically, between the Jews, internal to the Jews. And hold on, sorry. And it was against anybody who was Hellenized. Okay. Well, that may have gone on. But in 68, so this, sorry, this is actually, things are a little bit, it's okay. But in 168, what we have is, oh, no, sorry. This is right. Sorry. We have this other greater concept, non-Jewish. And it's interrupt what's happening within the Jews, because now we have someone, and again, this is Antiochus again, right here. He wasn't so great for the Jews. And in fact, he did things like attacking the city of Jerusalem, exterminating all of the males who resisted, sold women and children into slavery. Jerusalem city walls were torn down. The temple was made into a Greek citadel. Okay, so big problems here. No more sacrifices, no more festivals for the Jews, no more Sabbath worship, no more circumcision upon pain of death. Okay, so you can kind of get what's going on here. So now the internal conflict, not as important as what's happening. Okay, so Antiochus wanted to get rid of the Jewish religion altogether because it wasn't very Hellenized. Okay. There was a revolt in 167, and that's here. A revolt by the Jews. This is where Hanukkah comes from, actually, in case anybody cares. It was started by the Maccabean family. They kind of retreated up into the hills, and they started planning, and they fortified themselves, and in a very unlikely victory, the Hasmoneans, which are the Maccabeans, they won. And they controlled Jerusalem for a while, okay? Called the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, if you think back to how long it had been since they'd had any land of their own, this was a big deal. It was also unlikely, and that's where you get like, lights that were supposed to guide them for a day ended up guiding them for 8 nights, and they didn't go out anyway. You get Hanukkah there. It's kind of miracle-like that they won. So they retook Jerusalem. They rededicated the temple, of course. But they decided to force people to convert to Judaism. Okay. So these folks started to actually set up their own rule. Kings, rulers, everybody needs to be Jewish. Turns out not all Jewish people liked that. So we have another kind of internal problem, but it's not going anywhere. It's getting worse. And it turns out that in 63 BCE, so this is, again, it's a little, but they invited Rome, which had been kind of a rising power, to settle their dispute, which they did, and they never left. That was when Roman rule started in Palestine. Okay. That's all before we get to Jesus's birth in 4 BCE. Okay. So I made kind of a mess of this, but that's sort of the point. There was so much going on in that region in a relatively short amount of time, from about 300 to when Jesus was born. And the culture shifted massively. There was some internal Jewish fighting between urban elites, urban poor, and the countryside. There were all these external forces that were trying to control them. They were trying to control the external. It was a very tumultuous time. It was a big deal. And then Rome comes, and Rome is happy to take charge. And Rome, of course, can and does take charge. Okay. So, any questions so far before I get to Rome? Because this is, of course, the part you're going to start to click with things in the Bible. But do you see how that was just massive upheaval from that time? Just so much change. And you have these, especially if you think about the rural Jewish folks. They just want to do their thing. They are, again, subsistence kinds of farmers and fisher folk and all that kind of stuff. And yet they're being whipped around by the stuff that's happening in Jerusalem and the greater powers in Egypt and Babylon and Assyria. I mean, it's just a very tumultuous time. You can see why they sort of went, okay, Rome, if you can fix it, we'll be happy. Rome said, sure, you got it. And Rome and therefore at the beginning, Rome was very willing then to sort of let the Jews kind of have their temple back, continue their Sabbath practices, their festivals, their feasts, and circumcision and all of that. But the price was they were now under Roman rule until like 400 CE, right? Like, so Rome rules that area for centuries. Okay. The first Roman emperor, which came in, and now I am going to start kind of writing on our map, which came in 27, so very close here to the 0. The first Roman Empire was Octavian, and this is the beginning of what's called the Roman Empire. Before then it had been, the Roman Republic, but it was all over other parts of the world at that point. Now the Roman Empire is born, and you might recognize him by his other name, which is Caesar Augustus. Okay, first Roman emperor that the Jews knew. He's the one where we get the phrase Pax Romana. He was a good ruler in the sense that he kept order, he kept the boundary, he didn't overstep. That was often a power which then stretched the military chief. Sort of kept the borders, he kept the peace. Jews could kind of do their thing. One of the things, though, that happened was they had to rule different regions. So they would choose local rulers from the community, sort of, and this is where we start to get Herods, the Herodian dynasty. So this is where Herod the Great now rules over Jerusalem and the Galilean countryside. Okay, this is who was in charge, these two, when to the new chart now. Jesus was born. Now, because Herod the Great died in 4 BCE, and our scriptures seem to say that Jesus was born under Herod the Great, 0 doesn't seem to be a very accurate date for when Jesus was born, but that's sort of getting worked out.
And Herod is a historical figure. I'm just asking because I thought that I had heard something at point that they couldn't find besides the Bible some corroborating things, but maybe I'm thinking of something else.
They couldn't find
other evidence outside of the Bible to suggest that Herod, but maybe I'm not thinking of Herod.
No, it's okay. There are lots of things in the Gospels we cannot find corroborating evidence for. There are some things we can. And the Herodian dynasty is, historians from that time write about the dynasty. What happens is the Gospels have these people at the wrong dates.
Oh, okay.
That kind of stuff.
Okay.
Anyway, Jesus was born under Herod the Great, who died when Jesus. What happened with Herod's area, or actually Rome's area, is that his children kind of take over different parts of what Herod was ruling over. Now, a couple of things important about Herod the Great. He was kind of, how would I describe it? They would like to build real estate in good, like in areas he thought were good, right? So he starts building up things around, for example, the Sea of Galilee, okay? And towns there are sort of named after him and then in his honor, and all these things are being built up.
Sorry. building?
Yes, exactly. That is exactly, Vanessa said, put big letters, that is exactly right. And he built, the temple, when these guys rebuilt it, was, pretty paltry, actually. Herod the Great, redid it, and it was magnificent. Now, what do building campaigns need?
Money.
What?
Money
and
builders.
people.
Mm-hmm.
So Herod figured out how to get money, massive taxes, massive taxes, especially on the fishing industry around the Sea of Galilee. So you can build that up, and then use what's called corvée labor, which is basically slave labor to do the building. So, Caesar Augustus was okay. Herod the Great was, did some buildings and, did some things, but instituted a financial system that became a massive barrier for the poor, and especially the agricultural poor. Eventually, he was pretty sick for a while. He had all these problems with his 10 wives. And there was lots of palace intrigue, and eventually he kind of died alone and unloved, is sort of what Josephus, who's one of the historians from that time, just kind of unloved and unmourned, is what they say. From four then, and this is the Herod dynasty in Greece. From 39, so about 40, right? We get, wait, I'm doing this wrong. Sorry, there's overlap. So from 4 to 39, I'm sorry, I'll get there. We have Herod Antipas. When we hear about King Herod, killing all the babies, that's supposed to be under Herod the Great. It would have been under Herod Antipas, and he was cruel. He was a bit cruel for the sake of being cruel. And that is who's ruling through Jesus's life locally for the Jews. He's called King of the Jews. Also at that time, right around in here, we get Pontius Pilate as the Roman governor over that area. Okay, that should be a little bit familiar. And then, so then Pontius Pilate is described in history books, not in our Gospels, as, quote, by nature unbending, accused of taking bribes, murdering people, and endless amounts of just cruelty. That's Pontius Pilate. Our scriptures don't portray him that way, but that's sort of, as Vanessa said, some corroborating evidence. So these are the folks in charge when Jesus lived. And I'm going to stop there history-wise for today. We're going to come back to this stuff. But that's everything that was happening, basically, between Ezra and Nehemiah, which is the latest kind of historical accounting in our Hebrew scriptures. And honestly, 50, when Paul starts to write, but also just before Jesus was born. Massive cultural shift, constant turmoil, fighting, guerrilla fighting, people, really awful. These were really cruel, it turns out. Even though at first they were celebrated by the Jews. And that's the world that Jesus is born into. Rome comes in, takes charge, installs these local leaders who basically get to do whatever they want to do as long as they're giving money to Rome and keeping the peace. Rome's happy. Yeah.
And was the Herod during Jesus's time the son of Herod the Great?
Right. He's a son. There's a couple of other sons, Philip, I forget the other one's name, ruling other parts of the Roman Empire.
And was Pontius Pilate related to Alexander the Great? Because you said Alexander then died
No.
away too.
The people, they weren't related, they were his generals.
Okay,
that-
so Pontius Pilate was Alexander the Great's general.
No,
No.
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 The generals were Ptolemy and Seleucid. These guys are gone now. Rome conquered them.
Right. So above Herod the Great is
Caesar Augustus.
Caesar Augustus. Oh, sorry, I had the, yeah. So is he, like, how is he related?
He appoints Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Philip, Pontius Pilate, Agrippa, Caesar Augustus appoints all those people. Well, actually,
Okay.
there's another, we'll get there later, because actually.
But they're just appointed. They're all
Yeah,
people that have
well,
been
except
appointed.
to be clear, Herod the Great died when Jesus was born.
Right,
Then we get the next emperor and he's appointing all those people.
okay.
Yes.
That's what I was trying to figure out,
We'll
if
get
there
there.
was another
Yeah.
person after Herod the Great.
Yeah.
And it wasn't any of the
Another
people we're
emperor that
talking
comes
about.
in and less good than Caesar Augustus, but we'll get to that next time. So that's the history. I'm gonna move you guys back over.
Between our scriptures, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures. So I do think sometimes we forget that. Like we kind of think, oh, the Jews in Jesus' day were exactly like the Jews, stretching all the way back. Yes and no. Okay. Huge cultural shifts. And now we have to start thinking about, and we'll talk about this next time, but there's a number of Jewish responses to all these changes. Some of them being violent revolts, some of them being more nonviolent, and then Jesus and his disciples. Okay, that's their context, and we'll go into that more when we get into the story of Jesus's life. But I know that's a lot, but it's sort of meant to feel like a lot. Related to that, then, that I'm going to talk just briefly about is the economic and social context. And this kind of all comes out of all of that. But by the time Jesus is born, while there are still some families that have their farms, for the most part, like think prodigal son, the parable of prodigal son, right? For the most part, emperors, kings, the military, and the urban elite, they took these lands, okay? Just took them. And they were like absentee landlords, and whomever was living there when they took them now is paying rent and then farming the land for them. And eventually you get a system that collapses a bit, where if there's a bad season, a natural disaster, these folks go into debt, where debtors' prisons come in and become a massive thing in Jesus's day. This is why we Presbyterians say debts and debtors, because that was so common for the poor in that time. So there was also no Social Security, none.
But up to this time, Rome had the land.
Up till this time, so up until Rome, it was family land, family fishing.
Okay.
Yeah. Then when Rome comes, that's when the emperors and these appointed these kings, they start taking the land.
Mhm.
And that's when things get really, really bad for the poor, both in the urban centers and in the countryside. Okay, so let me get to the next page here. Economy. We have Herod the Great doing all his building. We have a new system where the emperor and the kings and the governors can take the land and then charge folks to live on them, and then they go into debt. That's all happening. Taxation becomes huge. There's taxes. Those are generally what goes to Rome, and there are tolls, TOLLS. Those are generally what anybody in power can basically levy if they can get it and keep for themselves. Whatever you can kind of get away with. Okay, that's a rough economic system. And of course, you have a few people way up at the top 1 to 2%, the history books will tell you. And 98 to 99%, there's no middle class. There is no such thing really as a middle class. Within that 99 to 98%, you have some artisans, some, kind of shop owners, but these are not professionals as we would think of them. They're part of the lowest, everybody's just economically way down. There was also at the very bottom of that 1 or 2%, the expendables. That's what they were called. You can imagine what that means. And the beggars, people who made their money by begging from everybody else. So most people were actually in that 98, they were barely able to survive. This is where we get our fisher folk today. They really weren't surviving well, not at all, in fact. And moving up economically or socially was not really a thing. That's the economic climate into which Jesus is born. So, where are we? Yeah, we're doing good. Oh, good. Okay. I know it's a lot, like always, but we do need to have some sense of what was going on when Jesus lived. And then as we move forward, we'll talk about also when Paul lived and the authors of our Gospels lived, which is a little bit later, but similar kinds of things. We have serious, Roman control. It is an occupying power. It is an empire. There is an emperor. And then all of this kind of land owning, debting, subsistence level folks barely making it day to day. And Jesus was born into one of those families. They were carpenters. Again, not like a professional class. That was simply how they made their subsistence living. Family, community, tribe, these things become super important when there's no Social Security and when 98 to 99% of people are living at or below the poverty line as we would kind of think of it. Okay. That's just a start. And that's really I'm just trying to give you a sense of the time between the Hebrew Bible and then when our scriptures were written, but really I'm kind of skipping a big chunk because our scriptures weren't written until 50. That was the earliest. Paul writes his letters around 50. So there's still about 50 years we haven't covered, which includes Jesus's life. But it's called the intertestamental period. Any questions, thoughts? I know that was hard for you guys to see. I'm sorry. I'm trying to put it together on Excel like I did before, so I hopefully will have that laid out soon.
Sounds a lot like today.
Well, that's so.
It sounds a little bit like we're setting things up for another Jesus.
So I'm reading a book actually called, well, I don't remember what it's called, but it's a commentary on the Gospel of Luke. And one of the things they're saying is our economic times are beginning to look a little bit like that time, especially if you look worldwide. We have Social Security for now. But yes, the wealth disparity is beginning to be as dramatic. We still have a middle class, but as I'm sure you've heard a billion times, it does seem to be shrinking a little bit. But yeah, it's we still can own our own land and all of that good stuff, and it's not being taken from us, but I know. So anyway, so yes, and that's the world into which Jesus is born, into this little town of Nazareth, which is a poor town in the Galilean countryside. Poor, densely populated town in the Galilean countryside.
And when you say densely populated, what would that have been for them?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. There's a lot of geographic
Mhm.
constraints in that area. Did you go to Nazareth? Nazareth it's like multiple elevations. It's got a lot of hills and kind of natural constraint, right? Am I remembering that right? I'm a
I
little.
don't remember thinking about it as much,
Oh,
but
okay.
as you talk about it, and there's another book that I'm reading that makes me think that could be
Mhm.
the other
Mhm.
book that I'm reading. It's a whole different place, but it talks about how the hills and the valleys and are very
Right.
constraining to things. So it makes me think that
Right.
could be,
It concentrates populations.
yeah,
Yeah.
and cuts them off from each
And
other.
cuts them off from each other. That's right.
Right.
That's
Given-
exactly right.
Given
Yes.
some weather thing happens and then they are cut off for.
That's right. Yep. That's
a very
exactly
long
right.
times.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So these communities become close. They depend on each other. And Jesus goes back to his hometown and says, I'm going somewhere else. You can see why they maybe got a little mad.
That's why they wrote about his life so much after he had died, because it was like, need to really know if that was really happening or if it,
I don't know, but I think Luke was trying to make a point.
Mhm.
The book I'm reading, part of the title is, oh, I know what it is. It's Plutocracy and Affluenza. That's the book I'm reading to describe the time that Luke was written. So plutocracy and then this kind of intense economic disparity. And he calls it affluenza.
Who
Just
wrote this book?
Ted Myers is his name. Mhm. It came out last year. Mhm.
Is it Affluenza? That was a book from a while back.
I think
though.
that's right.
Okay.
Mhm. All right.
Is that a real thick book?
I don't know how you define real thick. It's not hard to read.
It isn't.
No,
okay.
it's pretty accessible,
Mhm.
which is partly his goal, actually. Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. Good listening. Next time we're going to get a little more into what was happening during Jesus's life, and then kind of compare that to what was happening.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, that blue part where there's a big asterisk and the destruction of the temple in 70 cuts off Jesus's lifetime from when all of our gospels were written. And that's another massive change in that religion's practices, culture, and self-identity. Massive. And it separates the writing of our gospels from Jesus's life by about 30 years. 40 years. So Paul writes before. Okay. So we'll meet at this time next week. That will still work, and we'll maybe have another little conversation, and I'll think a little bit about it. Talk to some other folks that need to go, and I appreciate your flexibility.
Mhm.
Thanks,
Right.
all.
Thank you.
See you later.
Oh, I'm going to send out, by the way, I have the PDFs of all the handouts from last semester and all the outlines of all the Bibles. I'll send those out this week. Oh, there's just two documents, two PDFs, the handouts and the outlines. All right, bye all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.